مرج البحرين يلتقيان بينهما برزخ لا يبغيان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان
مرج البحرين يلتقيان, and he brought the two bodies of water together and they meet. Maraja bima'ana arsala al-bahrain. The meaning of maraja is that he sent them forth. He sent forth the two bodies of water. يعني المالحة والعذب. And what he intended by the two bodies of water are the salt water and the fresh water. Right? يلتقيان, they meet, they come together. يلتقي بعضهما ببعض, and some of them, or one kind of water meets with the other kind. البحر المالح هذه البحار العظيمة. The salt water body are these large oceans and seas, these large bodies of water. البحر الأحمر, like the Red Sea. والبحر الأبيض, like the White Sea. والبحر الأطلسي, like the Atlantic Ocean. And the Arabs use the word bahr for a sea, and they use the word bahr for an ocean as well. In modern geography, they would use the word muhit as well for al-muhit al-Atlanti, the Atlantic Ocean. Or they can say al-bahr al-Atlanti is a more traditional usage for the Atlantic Ocean. وهذه البحار كلها مالحة. These oceans and seas, these large, massive bodies of water, all of them are salt water. وجعلها الله تبارك وتعالى مالحة. It is Allah, the Blessed and Most High, who has made them bodies of salt water. لأنها لو كانت عذبة لفسد الهواء وانتنت. And that is because had he made them fresh water or sweet water, then the air would be corrupt and it would have gotten dirty or polluted. لكن الملح يمنع الإنتان والفساد. However, it is the salt that prevents the corruption or the pollution and the corruption of the air. والبحر الآخر, and the other kind of ocean or the other kind of water source or water, large body of water, البحر العذب, is the fresh water. العذب, fresh water. وهو الأنهار التي تأتي. These are the rivers. Here Allah uses the word bahr to refer to rivers. They are the rivers التي تأتي إما من كثرة الأمطار, and these rivers, they come from either large amounts of rain, وإما من ثلوج تذوب وتسيح في الأرض, or they come from snow that melts and runs about or comes down from high places on earth. And that's a reference to either polar ice caps or the tops of mountains or the high places where there is a lot of snow, which is a water source for these rivers. فالله سبحانه وتعالى أرسلهما بحكمته وقدرته حيث شاء عز وجل. And Allah, the most glorified and most high, has sent forth these two bodies of water through His wisdom and showing His capabilities wherever He has chosen to send them to. And He is the mighty and majestic. يلتقيان, and they meet. These two kinds of water, they meet. أي يلتقي بعضهما ببعض. They come together. عند مصب النهر في البحر. When the river has what they call, I believe, a mouth, that it reaches the end of its extended area, and it reaches into the ocean. So the water is transported from the higher areas of the ground and it goes down throughout the lands in winding rivers, sometimes all the way until it finally reaches one of the oceans or seas, and the water is dumped into those oceans and those seas. For subhanallah. So at those places, you find the two kinds of water, they meet one another at those places. فَيَمْتَزِجُ بَعْضُهُمَا بِبَعْضٍ. And so they mix. There is a mixture that happens at that place where the sweet or fresh water of a river is poured into the salt water of the ocean, and they meet and they mix. Right? They mix to a very limited degree, as we will see. لكن حين سيرهما أو حين انفرادهما يقول الله عز وجل, whether they come together or whether they remain separate, look at what Allah the Mighty and Majestic says, بينهما برزخ. There exists a barrier between them. There lies a barrier between the salt water and the fresh water. Right? لا يبغيان وهو اليابس من الأرض. It is, that barrier is a dry part of the land. A dry part of the land. And here you can say, as geologists say, that the ocean is a very deep place, and the rivers do not allow for this ocean, which is a massive amount of water, to run into the rivers and to take over the earth. But rather there is a sea level. There is a level at which the sea remains, and it doesn't overtake the rivers. Rather the rivers run into the oceans. At the place where the river runs into the ocean then becomes very deep and very expansive. So there is a kind of physical barrier of dry land under the ocean and at the sides of the ocean where the river empties out into the ocean. That is a physical barrier, and that's one explanation of the barrier that exists between the salt water and the fresh water, as we'll see, and we'll look at three explanations of that. لا يبغيان, they don't transgress this barrier that exists. They don't go beyond it. أي لا يبغي أحدهما على الآخر. So one of them does not transgress into the other one's place. The seawater doesn't go where the salt water is, and the salt water doesn't go where the seawater is. There is a barrier that is maintained between the two kinds of water. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَسَلَّطَ الْبِحَارَ وَلَفَاضَتْ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ. And had Allah willed, the Most High, He would have given the oceans, the larger bodies of water, authority to overtake and to spill out over the entire earth. وَأَغْرَقَتِ الْأَرْضِ. And to drown the entire earth. لأن البحر عندما تقف على الساحل لا تجد جدارا يمنع انسيابه إلى اليابس. When the ocean, you find it coming to the coastline, you find the shoreline or the coastline, the beach, you don't see a physical wall or anything there that stops the ocean from going any further. You don't see anything there. You don't see anything stopping it from going over the dry land and covering the dry land, right? مع أن الأرض كروية. While the earth is shaped in a round ball shape. While the earth is shaped in a round shape. ومع ذلك لا يسيح البحر لا ها هنا ولا ها هنا بقدرة الله عز وجل. However, you don't see, even with the shape of the earth being round, you don't see the oceans going over where the land is. The boundaries that exist there are clear, and the ocean doesn't transgress and go over the land. And so this is a description of the first understanding of the barrier. بينهما, it seems in this understanding, the barrier that exists between these two, meaning the barrier between these two bodies of water, the rivers and the oceans, and the physical land. That they have their place, and the rivers don't spill out over the land, and the oceans don't come in with waves and cover the land as well, at the shores. From the capabilities and powers of Allah, that is manifest through those actions. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى لَسَاحَتْ مِيَاهُ الْبَحْرِ عَلَى الْيَابِسِ مِنَ الْأَرْضِ وَدَمَّرَتْهَا. And had Allah willed, and He is the exalted and the Most High, the water of the ocean would have spilled out over the dry land and destroyed all of it. إِذَنَ الْبَرْزَخْ الَّذِي بَيْنَهُمَا هُوَ الْيَابِسُ مِنَ الْأَرْضِ. So then through this understanding, we see that the barrier that exists between them is the dry land itself, the land itself that acts as a barrier. هذا قول علماء الجغرافية. This is the position of the scientists of biology or of geology. This is the position of geologists. They say this barrier that exists between the land or between the rivers and the oceans is the land itself. It is the land itself. وقال بعض أهل العلم. Some of the people of knowledge here, and the knowledge being referred to here is Islamic knowledge. بل البرزخ أمر معنوي. They said the barzakh is a figurative thing. It is not a physical thing. There is a barrier that exists, but it is not a physical barrier. يحول بين المالح والعذب أن يختلط بعضهما ببعض. It's something that comes between the two types of water and prevents them from mixing. So the salt water remains salt water and the fresh water remains fresh water. وقالوا إنه يوجد الآن في عمق البحار عيون عذبة تنبع من الأرض. And they say that there are, at this time, in the depths of the oceans, there are springs. There are springs of fresh water that bring water up into the oceans, right? That water is fresh water. حتى إن الغواصين يغوصون إليها ويشربون منها كأعظم ماء. He said divers have dived, deep sea divers have gone down into these oceans and have found these pockets where there are springs of fresh water coming out into the salt water, and at that place the fresh water can be tasted. The fresh water has been tasted as fresh water in the middle of the saltwater ocean, right? No. And it's as the most sweet of the fresh water, the most sweet that fresh water can be. وَمَعَ ذَلِكَ لَا تُفْسِدُهَا مِيَاءُ الْبَحْرِ. And along with this, it is the salt water of the ocean doesn't corrupt it and make it undrinkable, but rather it remains at that source, drinkable, fresh water. Subhanallah. فَإِذَا ثَبَتَ ذَلِكَ فَلَا مَانِعٍ. And if that is truly established, then there's nothing preventing مِنْ أَن نَقُولُ بِقَوْلِ عُلَمَاءِ الْجُغْرَافِيَّةِ. And if that is true, then there's nothing stopping us from taking the position of the scholars of geography or geology or biology. وَقَوْلُ عُلَمَاءِ التَّفْسِيرِ. And the scholars of tafsir together, both statements together. وَاللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٍ. And Allah is above all things with power. Meaning it's possible for this verse to refer to a barrier that is a physical barrier, the land that exists between the rivers and the oceans. That is a barrier between rivers and oceans, between sweet water and salt water, fresh water and salt water. And it is possible for that barrier as well to refer to a non-physical barrier that exists between the two waters themselves when they meet. That there is a barrier at that place of meeting, and that the fresh water does not mix in with the salt water. It remains separate. And that is a very, very interesting angle of tafsir, and it is something supported by modern findings, as we will talk about in more detail, insha'Allah ta'ala. And let's take the opportunity right now to talk about that fresh water and salt water, they have very, very different compositions in terms of the chemicals, in terms of the structure of the water. There are heavy salt compounds in the salty oceans and seas. And in the rivers there is a sweet water which is good for drinking, and it supports a whole entire different kind of life. different, and those who fish, those who are who engage in the sport of fishing, much so they know the difference between river fishing and ocean fishing, or fishing at sea. So when you fish at sea, at the ocean, then you know you have a different set of animals that you would catch, a different set of fish that you can catch as a fisherman at sea than those that you would catch at land. And biologists have divided all sea life into 4 categories based on freshwater versus saltwater. They have said the majority of all sea life is in the first 2 categories. Life that only exists in salt water and life that only exists in seawater, and they cannot survive in the other kind. So there is, the majority of sea life falls into the first 2 categories, either freshwater life or saltwater life. And that means a fish that is a saltwater fish. Do you know a fish that is a saltwater fish? The most common one that we hear about? Catfish? I don't know. Shark? Swordfish? Okay. Generally the larger fish, of course, they're saltwater fish. They can't even fit into the rivers, right? There's a common one that I know, is tuna. Right? Tuna is a saltwater fish. It's in the oceans. And so you don't find tuna in the rivers. Tuna don't survive in the rivers. Or is there a fisherman here who would say that you found tuna in the rivers? And the tuna is something you cannot find in the rivers because it's saltwater life. So the biologists use that as an example of saltwater fish that cannot survive in the seawater. Saltwater fish that cannot survive in the freshwater, of rivers. So what that means is there is some kind of barrier that a tuna in his life, if he's swimming and he sees a river, he knows that he cannot swim into that river. If the ocean comes near where the mouth of the river dumps the water into the ocean, the tuna knows that it cannot enter there because he cannot survive the composition of that water. And as the waters they come together at that place, the fish will actually be able to sense a barrier and not want to, or instinctively not be able to go into the area that has the water that cannot support his life. So in that is a barrier for some of the creatures of the sea. As well, you have freshwater. The second type of sea life is freshwater or sweetwater, river water sea life that cannot survive in the salt water. So there are things that live in the rivers, and if that river dumps them into the ocean, they will die. Right? So these are, in these 2 first categories, those that stay their entire lives in the freshwater and cannot survive in salt water, as well as those that live in the salt water of the oceans and seas and cannot survive in the sweet water of the rivers. This makes up the majority of all sea life. And there are 2 more categories. Very interesting. There are some very rare species of sea life that can live in both. They can live in both. However, even within their lives, there's a barrier that is recognized between the salt water and the fresh water. What's that barrier? If you've heard about these kinds of fish, they spawn, they are born in a certain place, and then they leave that place that is salt water, and they go live in the fresh water. They leave the salt water, and they live in the fresh water their entire lives, and then near the ends of their lives, when they want to spawn, they go back to the place where they were born, and they don't mix between the 2 stages of their life. There's a barrier for them, right? A commonly quoted one is the salmon. And scholars of biology, they say these are called euryhalines. Probably mispronounced. I'm not a biologist, right? And they're of 2 types, anadromous and catadromous. Anadromous means they're born and they spawn in fresh water, and they live in salt water, like the salmon. The salmon or the striped bass. 2 animals that are what? They are born in fresh water, in rivers, and then they go and they live their lives out in the ocean. And then near the ends of their lives, they fight the current of the river that is pouring out into the ocean, and they fight to go back to where they were born and to mate there or to spawn there, and they die there as well. So at the beginning of their life, they're in fresh water, then they live in the salt water of the ocean, and they come back at the end of their lives. So even when we say the sea life recognizes a barrier between salt water and fresh water, the majority of sea life can only live in one or the other, with no stage of their life being in the other place. Then there's that minority that can live in both, but they don't go to between the two places whenever they choose. There is a barrier there for them in their lives as well. That means as adults that are living their lives, they do not go into the fresh water until it is near the end of their lives where they spawn and drop their eggs and die back in the fresh water. So it's even within them, within those sea creatures, within those forms of life, there is a barrier as well that they live by, that exists between fresh water and between salt water. An example of catadromus, that's the opposite, where the creature is born in the salt water and comes to live in the fresh water and then goes back to the salt water to spawn and die. That's an example of the eel, or some kinds of eels. In America and in Europe only, not all kinds of eels, but some kinds of eels in America and Europe. It's a very rare type of situation, right? They are born in salt water, they go and live in the rivers, in the fresh water, and then they go back to the salt water to spawn. Interesting. So amongst these four categories, even within the ones that are the minority that do not stay in one of the two places, respecting that barrier their whole life, they have, a certain time that they would cross that barrier. Only once. Once in the first part of their life, and then once in the last part of their life. So we find amongst biological findings what is a witness to the non-physical barrier existing there between the salt water and the fresh water. Subhanallah. فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ. So which of the favors of your Lord do you deny?
مرج البحرين يلتقيان بينهما برزخ لا يبغيان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان